In the Battle of Albuquerque in New Mexico, one battle out of a myriad of concurrent battles going on at exactly the same time, the coalition forces present in this area of operations were the 18th Pakistani Infantry Division of their regular army, as well as the 3rd Iranian Armored Brigade of their regular army forces, and they were responsible for an extremely important objective, which was the Kirtland Air Force Base, as well as also the road junction, which was the city of Albuquerque itself, as I-25 was an absolutely vital route, not only for the external invasion forces of the PLA's 14th Group Army of China and their 18th PAP Brigade of China, their paramilitary forces, but also for the logistical follow-up forces that would sustain them in the long run once they had made it deep inland and fanned out to assist the Trojan forces that were already inside the land, capturing their objectives, as it was absolutely vital to hold key nodes along key invasion and logistical routes for the external invasion forces, and then the follow-up logistical trains that would eventually come in to sustain them during the occupation phase after the victory had been achieved. These nodes absolutely needed to be controlled at all costs, as well as other key infrastructure and other assets. Airports being high on the list, as well as power plants, as well as water treatment facilities, as well as military installations, which were the absolute top of the list, and also of other relative importance were key political targets as well. Although there were many targets that needed capturing, many others would be destroyed as well, as this was indeed a target-rich environment for the invasion forces, as this was a vast nation, and the South Central invasion sector alone was enormous, which was primarily Texas, but also included Oklahoma and New Mexico. And within New Mexico, there were very critical assets to the American armed forces, such as the Kirtland Air Force Base, which had the single largest nuclear weapons storage facility in the world at 300,000 square feet, as live nuclear weapons were in various stages of storage or being decommissioned or maintained, or simply just remaining stored in this facility, and the Iranians especially were keen on taking these components and live weapons as war trophies for their own nuclear weapons program, as well as all related documents and information, so they could reverse engineer and create their own with ease, as well as also having live nukes, as that was their war trophy, as that was their reward for coming along on this massive proverbial adventure, as it would be called, as this was the largest single ever invasion put together in all of human history, topping even Operation Barbarossa, with an even bigger air armada, naval force, and especially in ground forces being over 3 times more than the invasion of the USSR in 1941. As all of these forces responsible for all their different areas of operation were all working towards achieving their own given objectives, which all culminated in one massive, enormous task of overcoming the land as a whole. Within the Albuquerque battle alone, the forces assembled were definitely more than enough for the task at hand, as New Mexico was one of the states that was slower to mobilize than were certain other states out of the 50 that comprised the land, as they had only managed to mobilize just under 20% of their forces of their National Guard and Reserve components, as their National Guard's 1st of the 200th and a mechanized infantry battalion had been mobilized, but it had been split up between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, as there were only 2 companies and a platoon in Albuquerque, with all the rest in Santa Fe to protect the key regime quarter and its facilities, with the rest posted in Albuquerque, bivouacked there to ultimately support the forces in Kirtland, which consisted of the different Air Force elements, squadrons, wings, and whatnot, that were posted on the installation, including also their pararescue forces and base security elements, as the Kirtland Air Force Base was such a critical installation to the American nuclear force that it was always at a high REDCON status, meaning a readiness condition status for specific to just that installation alone. And due to the international tensions, the forces on the installation had begun to dig in a bit and create sandbag emplacements as well as berms and trenches and foxhole systems, as it was anticipated with the massive Sino-Russian naval drills that it was possible that some type of attack could occur, but that never occurred to the Americans that the attack would be the largest ever invasion in all of human history, and the forces they had managed to muster were nowhere near enough to stem the tide of the enormous Chinese forces, not to mention that of their allies combined with it, as the Chinese alone with their military and paramilitary forces had assembled 10 million of their forces, with the Russians an additional 2 million, and the foreign expeditionary forces, which were the allies of China and Russia, assembling another 500,000, with the total force being 12,500,000. The American forces were far too stretched thin and were unable to effectively deal with this type of invasion, especially under the conditions of having no communications and no way to have any actionable intel, as their ISR network and communications were completely removed with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes that occurred at midnight, and all of the local electronic warfare jamming systems used by predominantly China and Russia that were being utilized in all the different regions of the land as it was under attack, under invasion. This ensured that the Americans could not effectively defend themselves, as there was no way to coordinate any kind of defense under these primitive conditions. And as a result, many would fall in the attempt to defend their positions wherever they stood, because they would be destroyed wherever they stood, because the enemy had ISR dominance and could see them when even the Americans could not see in return, as a result of losing their ISR network and their communications. Unable to communicate and effectively coordinate meant that they were unable to stop what was happening to them, as anything that could be seen on the modern battlefield could be destroyed. The missile forces firing in support, not just of the whole invasion as a whole, but just in this sector of the invasion alone, were immense, as the Pakistani 176th Artillery Missile Regiment, responsible for firing the Babur Alpha 1s, would be firing dozens of these subsonic medium-range cruise missiles, which were very accurate and were terrain-hugging cruise missiles with a sufficient payload, and also the Iranian IRGC 7th Al-Hadid Missile Brigade of their Revolutionary Guards, of their missile forces, would be firing their Shahab 2s into this area to support their forces capturing the Kirtland Air Force Base. And the Chinese Strategic Missile Forces assets of their 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades, heavily bolstered by called-up reserve battalions, able to fire older systems that have been stowed away specifically for their use, as well as also mass-produced systems which were massive in quantity, such as the truck-based TEL system, which fired the subsonic DH-10 cruise missiles, which there were an immense number of, would be fired by these reserve battalions, which reinforced these active duty brigades, who the active duty forces fired some of the latest and greatest of China's missiles, including hypersonic missiles, such as the DF-17 with its DFZF hypersonic glide warheads, as well as also the DF-100 hypersonic cruise missiles, and also the DF-21As, as well as others. And these would also be fired at Kirtland in support of the Iranian forces capturing the installation, as the 3rd Iranian Armored Brigade would immediately strike into the installation as soon as midnight had struck. They would leave their CCP regime properties, which were the Chinese Communist Party properties, which even China used to base their allies' units on, such as the Russians, Iranians, Pakistanis, North Koreans, Belarusians, etc. And they would strike out and immediately into the Kirtland Air Force Base, as these CCP regime properties were strategically purchased near their objectives, and sometimes they were able to be purchased immediately adjacent, practically back to back with their objectives. In this case, it was nearly similar to that, as these 2 armored battalions of the 3rd Iranian Armored Brigade would smash into the installation and begin to rapidly capture it with heavy artillery support from the M109A1 self-propelled howitzers of their artillery battalion, left over from the Shah era, but still very effective howitzers, which were 155 howitzers, would be firing in support of their armored forces as they smashed their way into the installation and rapidly began to capture it, with also heavy missile support from the Pakistani 176th Artillery Missile Regiment with their Babur Alpha 1s, as well as also the Chinese 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces Brigades, all firing in support of the Iranian forces as they rapidly moved to capture the installation in the opening hours of the invasion, as the Americans again had been stretched extremely thin, and although they thought an attack might come due to the international tensions and the Sino-Russian naval drills off of both coasts, they never anticipated that it would be the largest ever invasion in all of human history, topping even Operation Barbarossa by 3-fold as it pertained to the ground forces, as well as an even larger air armada and naval armada assembled as well for the task, as the Americans had puny forces in comparison to the forces assembled to invade their land, and the lack of communications and ISR networks due to the anti-satellite cyber strikes and electronic warfare ensured that the Americans were unable to stop what was happening to them. The air power, combined with the land and missile power, and even the naval power, was far too much for them to handle, as many tens of thousands of armored vehicles, combat aircraft in the thousands, ships in the hundreds, and missiles in the tens of thousands were all unleashed against America as the clock struck midnight. In the Albuquerque battle, the Pakistani 18th Infantry Division, as it was larger, of course, than the Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade, as this was a brigade and this was a division, would be responsible for most of the battlefield, extending all the way to the west of the Rio Grande River, as well as also the northern part of the city on the eastern side, just north of I-40, with the Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade responsible for Kirtland Air Force Base, the international airport, also called the Sunport, as well as the southern parts of the city proper that were just south of I-40. These forces would work together avidly and quickly, and although most of the combat operations in this battle would wrap up within the first 10 hours, this battle would end up being a 20-hour long battle because there would be a lull in the fighting from hour 10 to about hour 19, whereupon a large gathered militia type of force from further in the hinterlands in the desert would be informed of the Iranian positions based on refugees moving through the area, seeing these howitzers firing from this property into this area. As many tens of thousands of non-combatants would be slaughtered, as was the case in this invasion, within just this battle alone, as millions would perish on the first day alone. The tens of thousands that would perish in this area, which would be non-combatants, would cause the surviving non-combatants to flee in many different directions right off the bat. Some would be highly intelligent and would flee into the mountains, where there was a small group of Air Force Pararescue Special Forces elements that were training in the Cibola National Forest or Wilderness area in the Sandia Mountains, and they would end up being the leaders and trainers of these hardy desert and mountain people that would flee into the mountains and seek refuge from the invasion, while the rest would be reactionary armed civilians that would get themselves slaughtered, because the coalition, of course, had ISR dominance and could see everything, and the Americans could see nothing except what was immediately overhead or in front of them. And as a result of this, the coalition would get the drop on them before they would even know what hit them in most cases. Although it was war and the coalition would have losses, and the pararescue forces were definitely no pushover. They would definitely put up the best fight they could with what they had, as they did have some anti-tank weapons. It would not be enough to stop a force of this type of magnitude, this type of power, this type of composition, as it was far too heavily armed. There was too much firepower. There was too much ISR dominance, which enabled the firepower to be more efficient than it could have ever been in older times. And the air power committed to only this battle alone was immense, with 4 different squadrons, 2 from the Pakistani Air Force, or the PAF, and 2 from the Chinese PLAAF, or the People's Liberation Army Air Force. There would be 2 attack squadrons, or ground attack aircraft, or strike aircraft squadrons. The Chinese JH-7 squadron, which could carry an enormous payload per aircraft, and a Pakistani Mirage 5 ground attack squadron, which they were still relatively effective ground attack aircraft, although the JH-7 could carry over twice as much as a Mirage 5 in payload. The Mirage 5 was still up to the task. And the Pakistani fighter squadron in this battle, the JF-17B, were 4.5 generation state-of-the-art fighter aircraft, bridging the gap between a 4th generation and a 5th generation aircraft. China produced these, and Pakistan now did under license, and both air forces possessed these in their arsenal. These were A-1 fighter aircraft, and the J-10, a 4th generation fighter aircraft, was also an outstanding fighter aircraft, and the PLAAF would have a J-10 squadron patrolling the airspace over Albuquerque alongside of the JF-17B squadron of the Pakistani Air Force. The Pakistani Air Force's F-16C squadron would continue further north to aid the Russian 8th Combined Arms Army operating in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. The same would be the case with the Chinese PLAAF J-82B squadron, as they would move north with the Pakistani Air Force's F-16C squadron to provide the Russians air cover in their AO. As midnight had struck and the artillery barrage had commenced, the Pakistani howitzers laid down their enormous firepower from their M198 155mm howitzers, which were now turned against the land that had ultimately produced them, as these were sold in decent numbers to Pakistan during the Cold War, similar to the weapons that Iran still possessed from the era of the Shah before the Shah was overthrown. They still had some Western stocks of weapons as well, and now were being turned against the land that birthed them, as the 198s the M198s and the Iranian M109A1s opened fire on their various targets, which included the Kirtland Air Force Base and the International Airport, or Sunport as it's called, by the Iranian artillery, and the Pakistanis firing on massive parts of the city, including the downtown area, as well as the bivouac sites themselves of the 1st of the 200th, which was bolstered by Alpha Company from the 2nd of the 198th, which the 2nd of the 198th was an armored battalion, part of the 155th Armored Brigade combat team of the 36th Infantry Division of the Texas National Guard, but it was sent to conduct interoperability training just before the invasion had kicked off, to give these forces a bit more of a backbone, as it was desired for these forces as they had been mobilized, and New Mexico was a state that was slow to mobilize its Guard and Reserve forces compared to Texas and other states, but they had mobilized this one battalion, and it was split between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, with its different companies guarding the political sites of the state regime in Santa Fe, as well as also to assist in protecting one of the nation's critical nuclear weapons sites at the Kirtland Air Force Base, as it had its massive 300,000 square foot underground nuclear storage and maintenance facilities. And these forces were ultimately mobilized to help the pararescue and the Air Force security personnel to defend this base. But as they were leaving their bivouac sites, as they had lost communications at midnight, right as the first shells began to land and the first missiles were launched from within Mexico to target Albuquerque, these forces had leadership that got them moving, and they began to leave their bivouac sites, some of which, like city parking areas that were requisitioned for use by the National Guard forces, had contained their tents with ample numbers of MREs and water, bottled waters, as well as fuel and ammunition, which would all be hit by missile and artillery strikes coming in from the Pakistani howitzers, as well as the missiles coming in from the Pakistani, Iranian, and Chinese missile forces, as the air power coming in would contribute also in the close air support and even strategic strike roles, as the JH-7s and Mirage 5s would also hit strategic targets throughout the battlefield as well that were already pre-designated for strikes. These forces and their combined munitions in total payload weight were immense, and in the first sortie alone, well in excess of 200,000 pounds of munitions between both squadrons were carried and would be dropped onto this battlefield, as all of these aircraft combined were loaded down to the hilt. The J-10s and the JF-17Bs, although they carried few air-to-ground munitions for emergency close air support strikes, they were mostly laden down in their first sortie with air-to-air munitions, which were Chinese missiles on the J-10s, such as the PL-12s and PL-15s, which were the longest-range missiles in the world, the PL-15s, and the Pakistanis carried the same, as China had exported their air-to-air missiles, among many other types of weapons and hardware, to the Pakistani military as part of their effort to revamp Pakistan's defense industries and military forces. As again, the war had kicked off before the modernization was complete, but Pakistan's forces were definitely up to the task. And as the Iranian forces were even further modernized in the realm of ISR capabilities and drone integration into their forces, they already had a massive advantage over the American forces, who now had no ISR capabilities whatsoever at all and no communications, and now the Iranian forces were indeed beginning to get the revenge that the regime in Tehran had always craved. And now we go to the battle map, as merely 20 minutes past midnight, these forces had left their CCP regime properties and raced to other objectives as it pertained to the 3rd Armored Brigades comprising battalions, as well as also the 18th Infantry Division and their comprising battalions of the Pakistani Army's forces, as they were on different CCP regime properties which were strategically purchased for their forces as well. As the Iranians were now moving in with their 2 armored battalions to strike into the base, while their 2 other armored battalions would go for the southern portions of the city east of the Rio Grande River, and they also had 2 armored infantry battalions as well. Those would also play a role in the capture of their AO inside of the city, while the 2 armored battalions were smashing their way into the installation, coming in through the south as they smashed through the flimsy fencing. And although the Americans were beginning to attempt to fortify this installation due to the international tensions, it would ultimately not be enough for the forces that they now faced, as although the American Special Forces, the pararescue troops of the Air Force, were indeed, as mentioned before, no pushover at all, and they were not. They were adept warriors that were willing to go behind enemy lines to rescue downed pilots and other types of personnel stranded behind enemy lines. They were only armed with a handful of anti-tank weapons, and although they would indeed cause some casualties, as the coalition forces were not invincible and they would suffer some casualties, but ultimately it would be a drop in the bucket, including with the 3rd Armored Brigade of Iran. They would ultimately lose 9 of their state-of-the-art Karar main battle tanks to American forces, but that would be a drop in the bucket, as their brigade had a total strength of 256 of these Karar main battle tanks, and losing 9 of them was not really any type of problem for the 3rd Armored Brigade. They would also lose some IFVs, such as their BMP-2s and also some of their Barak APCs, but that would matter little as well. The Iranian force, their armored fist of their Karar main battle tanks, their BMP-2s and their Barak APCs, as well as their Sayed fast attack vehicles and their Lynx armored recon vehicles, as the Sayeds and Lynxes comprise the reconnaissance battalions of the armored or the reconnaissance companies within the armored battalions. These forces were a potent strike force, as well as also with their Shahed 238 loitering munitions, which would also play a large role in this battle, as they would help to turn the tide against forces that were dug in or trying to flee behind the line of contact or maneuver behind the line of contact to reinforce other forces or provide logistical support. The Shahed 238s would single out these forces and smash them, as also Iranian artillery and the air power assembled would constantly be able to strike enemies at the line of contact or behind it in depth, as the American forces would have virtually nowhere to run and nowhere to hide as a result, as the Chinese would be pummeling the installation with their very powerful and heavily armed JH-7 Flying Leopard ground attack aircraft, which carried close to 20,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions per aircraft. The first sortie of these aircraft flying over the installation would essentially elicit enormous damage, Within the first 20 minutes, as the Iranian tanks and their armored infantry and reconnaissance forces of these two battalions smashed their way in, as two battalions were attacking, this was merely one of the tank companies of one battalion and one armored reconnaissance company of one battalion operating in this center area, while other forces moved in as a pincer attack as the base extended roughly another mile to the east, as well as more of it to the west. This was just in the center part where the runways were, with the taxiways further to the north. These were all taxiways, and these were hangar buildings and other administrative buildings and barracks further up. These would all be struck, including these C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, these prop planes. These Shahab 2 missiles would come in and strike these different buildings, these hangars and administrative type buildings, as well as the JH-7s dropping massive payloads, some of them even danger close, as Iranian forces were racing into the installation, going deep within it, as the pincer essentially was moving through this area as rapidly as possible. But this map occurs at the outset of this battle. And this is the map that will be gone over, as these actions are occurring by the time these actions have officially come to their end, as again, the forces on this map that are doing these movements are moving through this area at the time of this action occurring on this map. As the Americans had helos that were airborne at the time, as they were conducting training when the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes had occurred, and thus had lost their GPS and other critical aspects of their navigation equipment, as well as also the electronic warfare jamming, which was provided by the JH-7 Flying Leopards, as they had the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods equipped. These forces were now flying blind and were not able to get in contact with ground control, and as these J-10 fighter aircraft were flying over the battlefield, they were firing their nose cannon, their 23 millimeter twin nose cannon, at this airborne helicopter right here, as well as this one having had fired a PL-12 air-to-air missile at this helo right here, at the same time that the Iranian SHORAD forces of the 3rd Armored Brigade, which this is their SHORAD battalion, it did not move here yet, is still on its CCP property, and it covered this entire area with its HQ-7 copies, the Yazara 3s, which were an HQ-7 copy of the Chinese HQ-7, which was an outstanding SHORAD system, and even the Pakistanis used the HQ-7P version, which was the export version for Pakistan. The Iranians had completely built a copy on their own. They had essentially reverse engineered it and built their own copy, called it the Yazara 3, and now they were firing these in support of their armored forces smashing into the installation at these airborne helos that were all being tracked and now being fired at, including these Ospreys, which were now flying in the capacity of a prop plane, as they could be utilized as a helo and fly like a prop plane aircraft, and now are being fired upon by the Yazara 3 SHORAD systems, as this helo here is being engaged, as these were all training at the time. This J-10 had fired one of its PL-12 air-to-air missiles from much further away as it flew in at this helo right here that it was tracking, while also a missile from the SHORAD system is coming in to hit it as well. As again, it was not uncommon in this invasion for certain targets to be tracked and fired at by multiple systems at one time, as the different forces brought to bear were immense, as this campaign was a massive campaign and involved wide levels of destruction. These were cruise missiles, these were Babur Alpha 1s, and this was a Chinese DH-10, both being subsonic cruise missiles flying in to hit targets on the installation. These, at the opening of the map, these are JH-7s, the ground attack aircraft, dropping massive payloads on their targets below. These are all base security in their Max Pro MRAPs. They have their weapons staggered as they're very confused. They're trying to respond to what's going on. They can see the artillery strikes hitting this area that had tents in it, and it was essentially a berm that had been constructed by engineering forces to basically establish a security area here and have their gun turrets on their Max Pro MRAPs to be able to essentially man this position. And their security forces and their tents had been targeted by Iranian artillery that was ISR directed by quadcopter ISR assets operated at the platoon level of each of these platoons of these tank companies, recon company of each battalion, as each battalion had one recon company, as well as also their armored infantry companies, as each battalion had two of armored infantry companies, with their 4 tank companies and their recon companies. And they were flying their platoon-level quadcopter assets and monitoring the battlefield in real time as they were grafted into the Chinese and Russian AI systems. All the data was processed and fed back to the combat data links in the Iranian vehicles. As the Iranian vehicles all had combat data links, they were further advanced than many of the other coalition partners were. They were closer to the level of Russia and China, but not quite, but they were further advanced than some of the other coalition members. And they had their combat data links and their ISR capabilities grafted into the Chinese AI, which fed them a steady stream of the updated battlefield information, which saved them time because they wouldn't need analysts to go through it and update it on the systems themselves, as it used to have to be manually done. Everything used to be done by analog, as there would be analysts watching the ISR footage and inputting the data manually. But now the AI system was rapid firing the data, and they could see it instantaneously where their targets were. Even with their own ISR assets at the high altitude level, such as their Mohajer 6 high altitude armed recon drone, which was also grafted into the Chinese and Russian AI systems, which now process the data at an extremely high rate of speed, making these forces even more flexible than ever before possible. As the Karar main battle tanks had a main gun with an exceptional range to it, many of them would sit back and fire further afield into the installation, as their other forces of both armored battalions would essentially pincer a larger portion of the installation. While this recon platoon, consisting of 2 Sayed fast attack vehicles and 2 Lynx armored recon vehicles, the Lynx being armed with a 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, and the Sayed could be armed with either 2 Tufan anti-tank missiles, which were like a reverse engineered but upgraded TOW-2 missile system, which the Iranians had, or it could be armed with 2 77 millimeter rocket projectors, which had 23 rocket pods on each side. And typically they would have 1 Sayed with the 2 Tufans, they'd have 1 with the 2 23 tubed on each side rocket projectors, and then they would have their 2 Lynx armored recon vehicles. And as these vehicles raced ahead to recon the area, including with their quadcopter assets, this had already occurred, with this single JH-7 dropping 8,000 pounds of ordnance on these base security forces that were trying to race into the area to respond and assist the essentially the forces being shelled. They were trying to respond to the attack. And as a result, they were hit heavily by the airstrike, as this single JH-7 dropped 8,000 pounds of ordnance on this entire group of base security forces and their MRAPs, as they all had M250 cals on top of their MRAP turrets, which were potent weapons, just like the 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns that were used by the coalition members were. And this MRAP had deployed troops out the back, security troops. And right as that happened, all these munitions came in and just pounded this area and annihilated these forces. This JH-7 would continue on to hit other targets on the base, as Iranian artillery was hitting this area, as it was ISR directed, of course, and there were more imminent strikes as these forces were trying to move into the area too to assist anybody and find survivors if they could, and they in turn were hit by the artillery strikes and annihilated, as these Ospreys and HH-60G helicopters, such as these, were all being shot down, including this. This one was shot down by the fighter aircraft, shooting it, the J-10, firing its nose cannon at it and annihilating it at the same time as this Yazara 3 missile got a lock on it and was fired at it as well. And as that was going on, the other air defense missiles were hitting their targets as well, and including a missile fired from this J-10, which was a PL-12 air-to-air missile. As this was high enough in altitude, it got a lock on it and fired its air-to-air missile and destroyed it. At the same time, this Yazara 3 missile was coming in to hit it. And as that was happening, Shahab 2s were hitting all over the base, not just in this 1 by 1 mile area, but the rest of the base as well, with its bunkers, its buildings, its offices, its administrative areas, its barracks, everything. This entire installation, its motor pools, everything was being hit by missiles. All the aircraft that were lined up on the tarmac, like these Hercules aircraft right here, they were all destroyed by these missile strikes. That's why they're all surrounded in purple, because these were Shahab 2 strikes, these craters with the smoke coming out. These were buildings that were hit where these aircraft were right outside and were destroyed by the blast radius. They're no more, they're destroyed. At the very opening of the map, this has already been done, so they're already destroyed. At the opening, more Shahab 2s are coming in. This is a parking lot right here, as indicated by the P for parking. These are all LMTV trucks. This Shahab 2 is coming right down on the remains of this building and these vehicles in this parking lot and destroying them. That's why this blast radius is right here. It's a large blast radius. This Shahab 2 is coming in and hitting this same area right here with this rubble from this former building, which only half of it's still barely standing. This building's mostly destroyed, but it's about to be hit by Iranian artillery from their 155 self-propelled howitzers, their M109A1s. This is a Chinese DF-2 coming in from one of their reserve battalions that was essentially attached to their active duty 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades, and this is being fired from a TEL system into this area to destroy these buildings, and all these personnel in this area are going to be destroyed along with it, including these on the outer blast radius and these as well, trying to run out of this area. These buildings are going to be horribly gutted from this strike. These MRAPs out on the periphery on this road trying to race in to assist and try to figure out what's going on, they're going to be destroyed in the strike as well, because they're right on the periphery of the strike and destroyed. And the Iranian artillery is going to come in and finish off these buildings as well. As that's happening, as all of this is going on, and these Iranian forces are racing into the installation, they're taking fire from the Americans, who are trying to fight back as this Max Pro MRAP has moved into the area and is firing its 50 cal at this Sayed fast attack vehicle, which in turn fires its Tufan anti-tank missile and destroys the MRAP, while these troops had dismounted from the MRAP and are running around and trying to fire at this vehicle as well. While that's going on, a pararescue QRF force and their Humvees, their armored Humvees, are racing into the area, and they have tow missiles attached to the top of their Humvees. And they fire their tow missiles after they get a lock on this Lynx armored recon vehicle right here. This one destroys the armored recon vehicle, and this one here is going to end up destroying an Iranian tank. They destroy a Karar main battle tank, as also this one also fired on the same tank. They both hit this tank and destroyed it. Armored recovery from the headquarters platoon of the recon company would come in and do their recovery on this vehicle, on this on this Lynx armored recon vehicle, and also the armored recovery vehicle from the headquarters platoon of this tank company is going to come in and recover this Karar main battle tank and pull it out of the area. While that's going on, the other tanks had opened fire and destroyed all of these up-armored Humvees like it was no issue, because the 125 millimeter main gun, even firing a standard fragmentation like a frag T shell, would be enough to destroy one of these. These up-armored Humvees cannot withstand a 125 millimeter shell of any type, even if it's just a frag T shell, but they fired their heat shells and annihilated these vehicles. Although these pararescue troops, again, there were no pushover, they did the best with what they had, but again, a force of this type of strength attacking a force that was this light, a force of this type of integrity is always going to prevail over a force like this, especially with air superiority, ground attack aircraft, artillery superiority, and missile superiority with cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes. There also is air defense superiority because the SHORAD systems were locking onto and knocking these helos out of the sky, as the Iranian SHORAD battalion was placed close enough to knock all of these aircraft out of the sky, as this system, the HQ-7, even the Yazara 3 copy, had a range of just over 5 miles in a radius, and they had an altitude of 3.4 miles at a maximum height, so they could easily hit these aircraft. It was not a problem for them. As all of this fighting was going on, these groupings of troops, as they were trying to run in here to try and see if there were survivors, help people, and got hit and turned by the artillery, as these bounded and covered ahead, they had already lost some personnel at the very beginning because a frag T shell had been fired into their direction and slammed into the ground in front of these troops and wiped them out, but the rest following behind bounded and covered, and they laid down in the prone and tried to fire. But these loitering munitions coming in, these Shahed 238s, would eventually strike and destroy them in conjunction with the tank shell fire, as at the opening, these tanks fired into this sandbagged area where they had parked an MRAP for a machine gun turret, so this would be like a ad hoc machine gun nest with these personnel. These tanks just direct fired into it and destroyed this place, this emplacement, rather. And these recon vehicles raced ahead, as again, on the outer periphery of this particular battle map, there is a large pincer action going on with the rest of the companies of both battalions. These are only 2 companies, the recon company and 1 tank company, as each battalion had 4 tank companies, a recon company, 2 armored infantry companies, and their headquarters and support company responsible for command and logistical operations of the battalion, of all the companies. So as they smashed all these forces working together between the armored recon and the tank forces, as well as the air power and air defense swatting down the helos left and right, literally, as well as ground attack aircraft, artillery, and missile strikes coming in, simply decimated these American forces. More artillery strikes here, as well as the tank-based fires which were coming in and annihilating all these vehicles, as well as even some fires from the Sayed fast attack vehicles, like the 2-fan-armed ones that were destroying the MRAP over here. And as cruise missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, artillery, airdropped munitions came in, it simply devastated the installation in a rapid manner. The battle for the installation would only end up lasting a few hours. And within the first hour alone, this entire part of the installation had been thoroughly smashed by just these two Iranian companies alone, with all of the missile, artillery, and air power brought to bear against this installation, aiding them in their advance, not to mention the loitering munitions as well. In the next map will be the rest of the airbase battle, as again, the airbase is large. Kirtland is a large airbase, and it extends further to the east and to the west and to the north. And this is but just the runway segment of the installation, as two companies essentially took this area as the recon vehicles that remained of this recon platoon moved into this area here to watch the flanks, while their other forces at the very end of this map are moving up into this area, because in the other map, the other forces are moving up here in a pincer-like movement to basically trap a large American force into this portion of the installation. As the battle will continue in the next installation of this series, the last remaining major fighting that occurred on the base itself would occur in the area of the taxiways and also the administrative areas, as the Iranian armored battalions raced into the installation before the Americans even realized what was going on. As again, the high rate of speed of these forces going for the proverbial jugular, racing into installations, smashing their way in, with the Americans lacking communications, actionable intel, ISR, the ability to coordinate, made them highly vulnerable and susceptible to being overrun in this manner, quickly and easily. Although the pararescue troops were the best that they had here, and they were able to try and put up a fight, they could only do so much, and they would not overcome a force of this type of power and integrity, as it was a very well put together force of armored troops with ISR dominance, loitering munition support, air support, massive air support, and enormous missile support as well, and artillery support from their own brigade artillery forces, which would conduct precision artillery strikes that were all ISR directed, of course, just as were the airstrikes, missile strikes, and everything else. In the next video installation of this series, the other major segment of the airbase battle will be covered, as the Iranian armored forces of two armored battalions from within their 3rd Armored Brigade rapidly smash their way into the installation and overcome it within the first 2 hours of the invasion, hurriedly seizing their objectives and prevailing, as the Americans didn't know what even hit them at this point. As this was going on, many other occurrences were going on at the same time all throughout this battlefield in Albuquerque. And although the Americans would fight exceptionally hard in this battle, ultimately the damage they would do would again be a drop in the bucket. It would mean something to the troops of the units that sustained losses, but overall, in the grand scheme of it all, it would mean nothing, as these losses were easily replaceable, and again were a drop in the bucket, as the coalition had every advantage over the American forces, and they would press all these advantages as they smashed their opposition, who could do nothing to organize and coherently resist. Not only that, but they lacked the firepower that the coalition possessed. They simply did not have enough ammunition, weapons, logistics, personnel, or anything that could resist an invasion of this magnitude with these types of forces assembled, which would bring on their ultimate demise, as America would become New China and become a colony for economic exploitation. However, the American people would never give up and would continue to resist, and a long, drawn-out war of occupation, subjugation, and insurgency would play out after the 4-day rapid fourth-generation warfare invasion will have taken place. As the Pakistani forces and Iranian forces in this sector, backed up to the hilt by Chinese forces, as well as even Russian assets to the immediate north of them, would play a major role in conquering the Albuquerque area. Next video will be the rest of the Kirtland Air Force Base battle within the Albuquerque battle.